Part 1. Liberation in silence. The biggest question you might ask yourself is, what if the greatest mistake you ever made wasn't something you did, but something you said? We often believe that the greatest mistakes in life are those caused by our wrong actions, the missteps we take along the way. But sometimes, it's not our actions that harm us the most, it's the things we say. Words are powerful tools. They can uplift, but they can also wound. A careless word can change relationships, break trust, and even destroy what worked so hard to build. Have you ever said something that you later regretted? Words that you thought were necessary, but ended up causing harm? These words may not have been malicious, but sometimes they come at the wrong time or are too many. Lacking thought and consideration. What if I told you that sometimes silence is the greatest gift you can give to yourself and those around you? In this noisy, argument-filled world, silence may be exactly what you need most. Not silence out of fear, but silence because you know that stillness offers control and peace that words never could. We often fail to realize that in silence, there is a profound strength that words can never replace. Silence is not avoidance. It is a choice. It's a power that many fail to grasp. When you hold your tongue, not only do you preserve peace within your soul, but you also give space for God to work in your life. God doesn't always want to use your voice as a tool of communication. Sometimes He wants you to be a wall, a shield, a fortress where nothing can penetrate. Sometimes your silence is the answer He wants you to display. Surely, you've had moments where you felt like your words weren't being heard, right? You've had those times when you argued, trying to defend your point, only to realize that the more you spoke, the more people pushed you away. This isn't a fault of yours. It's simply because you haven't learned when to be silent. Words can win arguments, but they can't resolve everything. True victories, the ones that bring healing and prosperity, can only be achieved when we choose silence. In the life of Ashira, a woman living in southern Canaan, silence was a lesson she had to learn painfully. Ashira was known as the woman who could never keep her silence. From an early age, she had something special: sharp intellect, a deep sensitivity to everything around her, and most importantly, an inability to hold her tongue. She spoke everything she thought. Every insight, every warning, every thought was spoken out loud, without hesitation. When Ashira married Anan, a calm and loving man, she believed that his love and patience would help her learn how to stay silent. But the truth was, the more she spoke, the more her relationship with him became strained. She thought that her words were meant to protect him, to help him, but in reality, she was hurting him. How can you help someone when you don't let them express themselves? This would be one of the greatest lessons Ashira would face. Ashira didn't realize that every time she opened her mouth, every time she interrupted Anan, she was making him feel overlooked, hurt. She thought she was protecting him, but in reality, she was leaving him vulnerable. She didn't understand that silence was the gift she needed to offer him. And this is the first lesson that Ashira had to learn: silence is not weakness. It is a conscious choice, a power that words cannot replace. So, what would you do if you could learn from Ashira's story? Could you accept silence and allow things that are beyond your understanding to happen without having to speak about them? This is the first step on the journey to reclaiming the power of silence. In the next part, we will explore Ashira's journey, from being someone who never stayed silent to realizing that silence is the freedom she had been seeking all along. Stay with us, because the next part will be a turning point in this story. Part 2. Silence as strength. Have you ever found yourself in a battle where words seemed to fail you, or shouting louder only made things worse? Sometimes battles can't be won by shouting, but only through stillness. This is the truth that Ashira would come to understand, though not without struggle. We live in a world that constantly urges us to speak up, defend ourselves, and make our voices heard. From the moment we're born, We're taught to express ourselves, to stand our ground, to make noise until people listen. But there's a deeper power that comes not from our words, but from our silence. Ashira, though gifted with intellect and the ability to speak on any matter, never understood the weight of her words. She saw her words as tools for solving problems, for correcting mistakes, for protecting the people she loved. She spoke freely, thinking that every thought that crossed her mind needed to be shared. She didn't understand that silence wasn't just the absence of words, it was the presence of strength. But what if I told you that silence is not about weakness, but about choosing when to speak and when to remain quiet? It's about knowing that some moments need words, but others need a pause. A silence that is filled with wisdom, not emptiness. Ashira didn't yet know that she was fighting battles with the wrong weapon, her words. But through her journey, she would eventually come to realize that the truest strength comes from restraint. Over time, Ashira's constant talking began to erode the peace she had once shared with her husband, Anan. He was a quiet man, deeply rooted in faith, who believed that patience and love could heal most wounds. But with every word Ashira spoke, the tension between them grew. Her interruptions, her corrections, her constant need to fill the silence made Anan withdraw. At first, Ashira didn't notice the change. She thought she was helping him, guiding him, leading him. But the more she spoke, the quieter he became. Have you ever pushed someone away, thinking you were protecting them, only to realize that you were suffocating them instead? It wasn't until one particular night that Ashira began to feel the weight of her actions. During a community gathering, Anan was asked to speak about the water shortage affecting their tribe. But just as he began to offer a solution, Ashira interrupted, offering a clearer, more articulate answer. The crowd's laughter at Anan's expense was a blow that Ashira didn't expect. She thought she was helping, but she had stripped him of his voice in front of everyone. That night, Anan didn't speak to her. Not out of anger, but out of something deeper. It was as though he had become numb, unable to respond to her words anymore. The silence between them became louder than any words could have been. Ashira believed that she had saved him from embarrassment, but in truth, she had robbed him of his dignity. Her constant need to correct, to speak, to fill every gap with her voice, had pushed him further away. Do you think you could ever learn the strength of silence in your own relationships? Sometimes, the most loving thing we can do for the people we care about is to simply stop speaking and allow them the space to share their thoughts, their feelings, their wisdom got as time passed. Ashira began to see the consequences of her actions. The tension in her home grew, her children began to lose their sense of independence, and her husband grew more distant. Yet, she couldn't stop herself from speaking. It was as though her words were a force of nature that she couldn't control. But in the silence of her home, in the stillness that began to settle after the storm of her voice, she started to sense something changing within her. One evening, while Anan was quietly repairing a fence outside, Ashira looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the weight he carried. She noticed how he moved slowly, as though each step was heavy with invisible burdens. She noticed the deep sighs he let out when he thought she wasn't paying attention. This was the moment when Ashira began to realize that silence wasn't just the absence of her voice. It was the presence of love, understanding, and respect. Can you imagine the moment when you realize that your words are no longer helping, but hurting? That realization is often painful, but it is also transformative. Ashira began to understand that silence wasn't her enemy. It was her opportunity for growth. In the quiet, she could hear her own thoughts more clearly. In the stillness, she could feel the pulse of the world around her. In the absence of words, she could truly listen. Through this process, Ashira came to understand that silence was not just a passive state. Silence could be a powerful tool for change. It was a space where God could work in her heart, where he could speak to her in ways that words never could. She began to see her husband in a new light, as a person who needed space to express himself, to breathe, to exist outside of her constant corrections. And in that space, love began to flourish again. This is the power of silence. It is not weakness. It is strength. It is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of wisdom. As Ashira learned to hold her tongue, she learned to hold her relationships together too. And the same can happen for you. When you learn the strength of silence, you learn the power of peace, the power of patience, and the power of truly listening to those around you. Stay with us, because in the next part of Ashira's story, we will see how silence begins to heal her soul and her relationships. You won't want to miss the transformation that takes place when Ashira finally understands the true meaning of restraint. Part 3. Silence as a test. Have you ever been in a situation where your words just weren't enough? Where, no matter how hard you tried to explain, nothing seemed to make sense? Have you ever felt like your words, though honest, just didn't have the right impact? This is where Ashira found herself caught in a cycle where speaking felt like an automatic response, but it never seemed to solve anything. In fact, her words only made things worse. This part of her journey was one of the most painful, but also one of the most transformative. In the previous parts of Ashira's story, we saw how her constant need to speak, to correct, to lead, was slowly eroding the relationships around her. The more she spoke, the more the walls between her and her loved ones grew higher. Ashira, however, wasn't ready to acknowledge the truth. She still thought that her words had the power to fix everything, to make the pain go away. It wasn't until she was forced into silence that she realized the profound impact her words had on her life and on the lives of those she loved. But silence is not always easy to embrace. At first, it feels like a punishment. It feels like something has been taken away from you. Ashira could not speak for 7 days. 7 days of complete silence. She didn't know why this had happened, why the prophet Sile had raised his hand to her and silenced her in front of everyone. At first, she thought it was a punishment for speaking too much, for overstepping, for always needing to be heard. But silence was not her punishment. It was her preparation, you see. Sometimes we are forced into situations that we don't understand at first, but those situations are the very things that prepare us for something greater. In those 7 days of silence, Ashira began to experience something she had never felt before: clarity. In the absence of words, she could hear her own thoughts, her own heart. She could hear her children, her husband, and the world around her in a way that she had never been able to before. Have you ever had a moment when you just stopped and let everything around you settle into stillness? It's in that stillness that we find the answers we've been searching for. Ashira's silence was the beginning of her transformation. For the first time in her life, she was truly listening, not just to the words of others, but to the whispers in her own soul. During these 7 days, Ashira began to realize how much she had been controlling everything around her. She had been so busy speaking, so busy trying to fix things with her words, that she hadn't noticed how much of the world had been passing her by. Sometimes, the greatest lessons we learn come from doing nothing at all. By simply holding her tongue, Ashira started to see the world in a new light. She noticed the quiet strength in Anand's prayers, the calm in her children's hearts, and the peace in the air around her. She felt what she had never felt before: freedom. But Ashira's journey wasn't just about finding peace within herself. Her silence became a test of faith. How many times do we speak when we should pray, when we should listen? How many times do we interrupt God's work in our lives because we think we know better? Ashira had to learn that not every situation requires a response. Not every moment needs to be filled with words. Sometimes, the greatest thing we can do is be silent and trust that God is working behind the scenes. Her voice returned on the 8th day. It wasn't just a physical return to speaking. It was a spiritual rebirth. Ashira's voice now had purpose. It wasn't a tool to control or correct. It was a tool to heal, to guide, and to build. She had learned the most important lesson of all. Silence is not the absence of power, but the presence of divine timing. Can you imagine how different life could be if you learned to pause, to listen before speaking? What if every word you spoke was carefully considered, prayed over, and chosen for its purpose? That's what Ashira began to realize. Words are powerful, but they carry the most weight when they are spoken at the right time, in the right moment. Ashira's silence was a test of her patience, her faith, and her trust in God's plan. And in that test, she passed with flying colors. Silence doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong. In her silence, Ashira found the strength to trust, to listen, and to let go of her need to control. And through this, she became not just a speaker of words, but a listener of hearts, a guide who led not with her voice, but with her presence. Imagine how your life would change if you learned to embrace silence as a strength rather than a weakness. It's in those moments of quiet that we often hear God's voice the clearest. It's in those moments that we allow His presence to fill us, to guide us, to transform us. Ashira's story teaches us that silence is not something to be feared. It's something to be embraced. It's a place where healing happens, where relationships are restored, and where true wisdom is found. Stay with us, because in the next part of Ashira's journey, we will see how her silence brings about not just healing, but true transformation in her life and the lives of those around her. You won't want to miss the profound impact that silence can have when we choose to trust God's timing. Part 4. Healing through silence. Have you ever experienced a time when everything in your life seemed out of control, and yet you discovered a quiet peace in the midst of it all? Sometimes silence can heal wounds that words cannot. This is exactly what Ashira came to understand as she embraced the silence that had once seemed like a punishment. Through her silence, she began to heal not only her own heart, but the hearts of those around her. In the stillness, she found a freedom that words had never brought her. Before her silence, Ashira had lived a life full of words. She thought that by speaking, she could protect, guide, and correct. But she had failed to realize that her words, though spoken with love, were often an obstacle. They were an attempt to control, to fix, and to shape the world around her. But what if true healing doesn't come from fixing things, but from allowing things to be as they are, to breathe in their own time? After being silenced for 7 days, Ashira's perspective shifted completely. When her voice returned, it was different. It wasn't just her voice speaking, but her heart and spirit guiding her words. Her silence had taught her patience, understanding, and most importantly, it had shown her the power of restraint. The silence was no longer something to fear. It was her teacher, her guide. The transformation in Ashira's life was subtle at first. Her husband, Anan, began to smile again. The weight on his shoulders lightened, and his prayers grew deeper. Her children began to speak up, to share their thoughts without fear of being interrupted or corrected. The home, once heavy with tension and words, now felt like a peaceful haven. This is the power of silence. It allows space for healing, for listening, and for growth. But healing through silence wasn't just about what Ashira experienced within her family. It was about her entire approach to life. She began to understand that silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the presence of wisdom. When we choose to be silent, we create space for God to move in our lives, for Him to speak to us in ways we cannot hear when we're constantly talking. It's in those quiet moments that God's direction becomes clear, His will becomes apparent, and His presence becomes tangible. As Ashira embraced this new understanding, her life became a testament to the power of quiet faith. Her silence became a form of prayer, a way of surrendering her will to God's. She no longer felt the need to control everything with her words. Instead, she let things unfold in their own time, trusting that God was working behind the scenes, even when she couldn't see it. True faith is not in what we do, but in what we allow God to do in us and through us. But healing didn't stop at Ashira. Her family began to heal as well. Her husband, Anan, no longer felt diminished by her words. He could speak freely, knowing he would be heard and respected. Her children no longer stuttered when they spoke. Instead, they began to express their thoughts and feelings, unburdened by the constant guidance of their mother. The silence that Ashira had feared became the instrument of peace and restoration in her home. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is give others the space to speak, to be themselves, without interruption. In her community, Ashira's story began to spread. She wasn't the woman who spoke too much anymore. She was the woman who had learned the art of listening, the woman who knew when to speak and when to remain silent. Her wisdom was no longer measured by the number of words she spoke, but by the depth of her presence, the calmness of her spirit. People came to her not for advice, but for peace. They sought her presence, her stillness, and the quiet strength she exuded. Ashira's transformation was not just internal. It affected everyone around her. Her silence became a source of strength for others. She was no longer seen as the woman who had too much to say, but the woman who had learned to trust God's timing, to trust that everything would unfold in its right time. People were drawn to her because she no longer fought against the world with her words. Instead, she allowed it to unfold, trusting that God was in control. Have you ever wondered how different your life could be if you allowed silence to heal the broken parts of your heart? What if you stopped trying to fix everything with your words and simply let things be? What if, in your silence, you found the peace and healing you've been searching for? Ashira's story teaches us that true healing comes when we allow ourselves to surrender to God, to others, and to the natural course of life. It is in the quiet moments that we hear God's voice most clearly, and it is in those moments that we experience His healing power. In the next part of Ashira's journey, we will see how her silence not only healed her family, but also transformed her role in the community. Stay with us as we explore the final steps of Ashira's transformation and the profound wisdom she gained through the sacred art of silence. You won't want to miss the life-changing lesson that Ashira's story has to offer. Part 5. Silence as a Divine Gift. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to walk through life with a quiet confidence, knowing that the right words will come at the right time? What if your silence is the answer to a prayer you've been waiting for? This is the final chapter of Ashira's journey, a chapter where she learns to embrace silence, not just as a tool for personal growth, but as a divine gift. Her transformation didn't just change her home, her relationships, or her community. It changed her very understanding of how God works in her life. By the time Ashira had learned the power of silence, she had already experienced the transformation it could bring to her heart. She had felt the peace that came from restraining her words, the healing that followed her choice to listen more than speak. But now, Ashira was about to learn that silence wasn't just for her benefit. It was for God's glory. True silence, the kind that brings divine peace, isn't just about shutting out the noise. It's about making room for God to move. In Ashira's case, her silence was no longer a passive state. It was an act of surrender to God's will, a willingness to let go of control and trust that God would speak through her when the time was right. She had learned that silence wasn't about being weak or timid. It was about being strong enough to wait for God's voice. Imagine how powerful it would be to trust that your words would carry weight because they were given to you by God. Imagine knowing that when you speak, your words carry the weight of heaven behind them. This is the kind of authority that Ashira gained through her silence. She learned that, when God's timing was right, her words would be exactly what was needed. She no longer had to fear silence or feel pressured to speak. She knew that, when the time came, she would speak with wisdom, clarity, and authority. Ashura's story is a profound reminder that silence is not the absence of action. It is the presence of divine timing. When we choose to be silent, we are not passive. We are active participants in God's plan, allowing Him to work in our lives and in the lives of those around us. This was the greatest lesson. Ashura learned silence wasn't something to be avoided. It was something to be cherished, something to be used for a higher purpose. In the days that followed, Ashura's role in her community began to shift. She was no longer just a woman who had a lot to say. She became the woman who knew when to speak and when to remain silent. People began to come to her, not for her advice, but for her wisdom. They sought her presence because they recognized the peace she carried within her. Her silence had become a powerful witness to those around her. They could see the strength that came from her restraint, the wisdom that came from her waiting. Do you realize how powerful silence can be in your own life? When you choose to remain silent, you create space for God to work. You allow Him to speak through you, to guide your words and actions. When you learn the art of silence, you no longer have to force your way through life. Instead, you can trust that God will provide the right words at the right time, and that when you speak, you will be speaking His truth. In the final stages of Ashura's transformation, she became a living testament to the power of divine silence. Her life was a powerful example of what happens when we trust God with our words, when we allow Him to speak through us instead of speaking on our own. Ashura's story shows us that true power doesn't come from how much we speak, but from how well we listen, how well we wait, and how deeply we trust that God will provide the right words when the time is right. As Ashura continued to live out her lesson of silence, her life became a beacon of hope and peace for others. Women from her community came to her, seeking guidance, not for her words, but for the stillness she carried. They sought her presence, her wisdom, and the quiet strength that radiated from her. Ashura's silence had become her greatest gift, not just to herself, but to everyone around her. What if you could learn to carry that same silence in your own life? What if you could stop trying to control every situation with your words, and instead let God take control? Silence is not just a retreat from the world. It is a powerful act of faith and trust. When we choose to remain silent, we are choosing to trust that God is at work, even when we can't see it. It's in that silence that we are able to hear His voice more clearly and follow His guidance more faithfully. And so, we come to the end of Ashura's story, but it is only the beginning for you. If you've been touched by Ashura's transformation, I invite you to ask yourself, what would happen if I chose to embrace silence as a divine gift? How would my relationships change? How would my faith grow? How would I find peace in the midst of the noise of life? Ashura's journey teaches us that silence is not something to fear. It is something to embrace. It is through silence that we find God's voice, and it is through His voice that we find our true purpose. And next time you're faced with a difficult situation, remember Ashura's story. Pause, wait, listen, and when the time is right, speak with wisdom and peace, knowing that your words will carry the weight of heaven behind them. And before you go, I invite you to reflect on this one final thought. What promises might you be missing out on because you've spoken too soon? What could happen if you chose to trust God's timing, to wait for His voice before you speak? This is the power of silence. Embrace it, trust it, and let it transform your life just as it transformed Ashura's. Conclusion: the power of silence, a path to healing. As we come to the end of Ashura's incredible journey, I want to ask you one final question. What would your life look like if you stopped rushing to speak and instead chose to listen, wait, and trust God's timing? Silence is not weakness. It's a divine invitation to surrender, to trust, and to allow God to work in ways we can't even begin to comprehend. Ashira's transformation wasn't just about her relationships or her family. It was about her soul, being healed through the sacred power of silence. What if the greatest healing in your life could come from something as simple as holding your tongue? What if the peace you've been searching for isn't found in more words, but in the quiet moments where you allow God to speak to your heart? In this fast-paced world, we often feel like we need to have the right answer, to constantly speak, to defend, to explain. But as we've seen from Ashura's story, true strength comes when we embrace silence, not as a defeat, but as a gift. When we stop speaking out of impulse, we give space for God to speak into our hearts. And it's in that space, in that stillness, that we discover the most profound healing dot. So, if this message has touched your heart, I encourage you to reflect on this. What are the moments in your life where silence could bring healing, clarity, and peace? Take a step back, allow God to move, and watch as your soul is transformed by the power of waiting, listening, and trusting in divine timing. If you found value in Ashira's story, and if you're ready to embrace silence as a tool for spiritual growth, I invite you to become part of our community. Healing the soul is not just a channel. It's a journey towards transformation, peace, and growth. We're here to support one another, to learn together, and to walk this path of healing through silence, trust, and divine guidance. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this message with anyone who needs to hear it. Together, let's create a community where we embrace the quiet, listen to God's voice, and find the healing we need for our souls. Thank you for being part of this journey. Remember, true power is not in how much we speak, but in how we listen, wait, and trust. May your silence lead you to the deepest healing of your soul. Subscribe now, and let's continue this transformative journey together. Healing the soul starts with you.